So, I look at things like that, the physical evidence, for example, looking at the Roswell crash, one of the bits that I've always been interested in from that is the morphing metal stories, where, there's allegedly you have this foil and you scrunch it up and then it just unravels itself and it looks totally perfect, That story has come out from multiple people, multiple occasions, decades apart. There was a video made by Jerry Croth where he was actually shown this by one of his students in a lecture in the 1960s when he was lecturing. He had nothing to do with Roswell. It was just one of the children in his class or one of his students at the university, I forget whether it was a college or university. They brought it up to him and they said, have a look at this, sir. And they scrunched it up and that was in the 60s, so that... And then there's the June Crane story, which was documented by James Clarkson. Great investigation by him. He interviewed her. She said that she held this metal. She said she was told that there were bodies recovered from the craft, and taken to Wright-Patterson. So I think there's enough evidence to say that the physical material has been recovered. And David Rudiak's site, Roswell Proof, I think it's called, he has 60 accounts of people that have handled the memory metal and other physical artifacts. So that's, I think, a very, very interesting area of study. And, again, on that sort of theme, the other thing I look into is the ancient aliens. I've looked into that. I've been looking, like many people, looked into that for years, and I read the 12th Planet book, which was the first Zecharia Sitchin book. I've heard a lot about that and read bits of it, but I read the whole thing, and I took quite a few notes on that, because people had said, for example, that Sitchin was putting out disinformation because he had
Freemasons.
Right. And I've got that picture in the book because somebody posted a YouTube video where he appears to be Sitchin and he's dressed in full Masonic regalia at a ceremony. For it does very much look like him. The video's a little bit blurred, so it might not be him, but I have to say it's a pretty darn close match when you look at the image. I put it in the book. So Sitchin, he had an office on the 33rd floor of was it New York or something? I can't remember. It was one of the universities that was associated with or something. So was he giving us some of the truth? And I think the 12th planet story is not correct, or at least not in the way he described all the details. Again, if you look at the orbit of Planet X that he puts in the book, from an astronomical standpoint, that orbit is not viable. So in other words, if it was that orbit was as he showed it, I think it would have flown out of the solar system. It wouldn't have been in that orbit. It couldn't. The way he described that, it wouldn't have been in that orbit. And I've always been sceptical about there being such a large planet, because you would be able to see it, if not directly. I mean, as I pointed out in the book, and I pointed out in other talks we've done, they can spot comets which are about 15 miles across out at the orbit of Jupiter now. And they're only 15 miles across. They don't give off any light. The tiny things, they give off a little bit of this sort of gas plasma discharge, which is what it appears to be. And that's what they detect, and they're really tiny, and they can see them. These are amateurs, so we're not talking about NASA. So anything that's going to be moon size, planet size, they're going to see it, I'm not talking about NASA. I'm talking about amateurs. So I was a bit sceptical of that Planet X story.
It would have come out, wouldn't it? And people see Nibiru and everything. Well, there was, there'd have been researchers out there,
they would have seen it. And there's various stories that people come out with. But, so if we, in other words, what if Sitchin was deliberately putting out the Planet X story to cover up some of the other stuff, that there was an ancient visitation by aliens, and they are somehow involved in the creation of humans and the development of humans. It may be directly, maybe the story about humans being genetically engineered is true. And of course this is what Lloyd Pye talked about. So what I did was, from the Sitchin book, which I'd been meaning to do for years, and anyone can do this, because Sitchin draws on two main sources: the Enuma Elish, which is one of the Babylonian creation myths, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And those are ancient documents, the real, the scholars have studied them for years, since they've been discovered for probably a couple of 100 years at least. And you can get English translations online. There are several, and I used two translations of Enuma Elish. I went back to original translations that I found, and I checked them against what was in Sitchin's book and the way he'd written them and how they're actually written and da-de-da. And if you look at it, yes, you can certainly see an interpretation which isn't inconsistent with the idea that humans were created by another race, and maybe there was some type of cataclysm in the solar system, millions of years ago, or tens of thousands of years ago, which had various effects on the Earth, and this sort of thing. And I mean, maybe that ties in with what Velikovsky talked about with the Venus coming out of Jupiter and this sort of thing. Maybe some of that ties in with the Babylonian creation myths. I won't go into that much here, but so I do think there is something in Sitchin's work on the Anunnaki. They didn't. he has one chapter called "People of the Fiery Rockets," and he claims that the Anunnaki landed on Earth in essentially chemical rockets. That's what he describes in the book. But of course, you're in the midst of the Apollo program. Or sorry, not in the midst of it, but just after it, because the Sitchin book, the first one, was published in '76, so it's 4 years after the last alleged landing. So he's adopting that paradigm to fit with his narrative, and I thought that was a bit stupid, really, because he doesn't really tie it in with the UFO issue that much. I think he mentions it very briefly. So the Sitchin book, I think, has quite a lot of interesting information. It's very well written. It's very much like a narrative of historical documents. But it's very well written, and he was obviously a very good writer. And but I don't buy the Planet X. I don't buy that the Anunnaki came from Planet X, and I don't buy that they came in chemical rockets. I think that part's wrong, and I think Sitchin should have been smart enough to work that out, really, from the information he had available to him even back then, But what is interesting as well is this. This was something that Richard Hall mentioned to me, which ties into the Sitchin story, was that there is this thing you've got to look at, which is that we have a lot of similarities with aquatic creatures. And this, I think, has some connection to the Sitchin story. If I can find the name of the guy in my books, I can't remember the name of the stuff off the top of my head. But yeah, so Lloyd Pye talked about the Sitchin story and the aliens, sort of interfering with human genetics. And I think it was Lloyd Pye who also mentioned to me the story of the aquatic ape, which was Eileen Morgan, I think was her name, if I got her name. Elaine Morgan, I think, sorry, not Eileen. And she'd come out in the 70s looking at how there was some sort of correspondence between certain aquatic mammals and humans. One of the things being that certain aquatic mammals have subcutaneous fat, and apes and gorillas don't have subcutaneous fat, and also their sweat glands. The sweat glands of apes and gorillas are very different to our sweat glands. they are much more similar to, for example, aquatic mammals. And the voice box as well. Our voice box is more similar to a dolphin's voice box than it is to chimpanzees. And so, you start to stack these things up, and I've got a table in this book, if I can find it, which I got from a paper by Elaine Morgan, and I put this in the book, and I just sort of edited it slightly because there were a couple of terms that she didn't explain. And I sort of tacked this on the end of the Sitchin story, because Sitchin doesn't mention this. So if you look at the characteristics of humans and aquatic mammals, for example, I've got a list from Elaine Morgan. Habitual bipedalism, what does that mean? That means that you walk on 2 feet or 2 legs regularly. Humans do that. Apes don't. Savannah creatures didn't. Aquatic mammals don't, of course. Loss of body hair, that's apparent in humans. It's apparent in savannah dwelling animals, and it's also apparent in aquatic mammals. Equine thermoregulation, that's the ability to sweat. Only humans and aquatic mammals have that. So aquatic mammals can sweat, but apes can't do that. Vaginal membrane, that's a hymen. Only humans and aquatic mammals have that. Enlarged sebaceous glands, that's for sweating as well. Only humans and aquatic mammals have those. Psychic tears, which is, I think, based on how you feel. Only humans and aquatic mammals have those. And volitional breath control, this is an interesting one. The ability to hold your breath. Only humans and aquatic mammals can do that. Other mammals can't. And a descended larynx, so this is where your voice box is and everything. Only humans and aquatic mammals have that. So, and also that what was, as I mentioned, Richard Hall mentioned to me, was this Eugene McCarthy, PhD. He's also looked at the similarity between humans and pigs.
Yes, there was
And as we know, as everyone knows, you can have a pig's heart valve transplanted, can't you? Quite a few people have that operation done now, and I think there's been something to use certain pig blood, hasn't there? Or serum from pig's blood, I think, has been used. I think there's something from pig's blood. I can't remember what it is, which has been used in treatment of human conditions. And so he points out the similarity between pigs and humans, this Eugene McCarthy, in a similar way to what I've done there with the Elaine Morgan table that I mentioned. And so if you look at where pigs came from, domesticated pigs were part of the suite of plants and animals that were developed in the upper reaches of the Euphrates River about 10,000 years ago. The earliest domestic pigs in Anatolia are found in the same sites as domestic cattle in what is today southwestern Turkey about 7,500 calendar years BC, during the late and early pre-pottery Neolithic period. So, again, this ties in with this time period which is sort of mentioned in the 12th Planet book, and these aliens being involved in giving out, and this is what Lloyd Pies talked about, domesticated animals and agriculture, with specialised wheat which has been developed, because wild wheat, you can't get any nourishment from that. The seed heads are way too small. It's the actual cultivated wheat which is way different, and corn as well. And these seem to they just came into use virtually overnight, it seems. There doesn't seem to be any real sort of history behind the use of domesticated animals and crops. It appears that they sprung up with the Sumerian civilization or around the same time. So again, I think that is good evidence that there was some other agency involved, and it wasn't humans. There was some other civilization that had come in and started doing things around that time. So I explore a little bit about that. There's other books that have been written, and I recommend some of the essays by Lloyd Pye about that. So really, that's a sort of first 3/4 of the book, or that's some of what's in the first 3/4. There's other stuff as well. And then, of course, the cover, which was
done for me by a chap called Peter Lomas, very kindly, who lives fairly locally actually. And I sort of gave him a general idea, and he did a great job on the cover for me. The cover also has got this image of the alien head crop circle, as I called it. And that, that's obviously for the second half of the book, which is about the crop circle phenomenon, such as I've investigated it over about sort of 10 years or so, on and off. And so I really go into that. I mention the history, which has come from the VLT research website, and look at some of the crop circle phenomenon. And again, it's the same sort of story. You get the researchers who are just looking at crop circles. They might talk a little bit about UFOs, a little bit about aliens, but they don't see other correspondences with other phenomena. And another thing which I think no crop circle researcher will dispute that's involved with the phenomena is energy. They talk about going into a crop circle. There's an energy. They talk about the crop circle being created with an energy, of some type. They're created using energy. And again, that's the key concept, which we've already mentioned here. And I don't, go into a lot of detail about specific cases of crop formations, really, other than what I consider to be the really interesting ones. I do, for example, talk about the formation by board stomping, the Doug and Dave characters and the circle makers, and basically a lot of that information, a fair proportion of it came from Richard D. Hall's film, Crop Circles, Hidden Truth. There's a lot of good information in that film, even though I think it's either an hour or 90 minutes, I can't remember. But if people haven't seen Richard Hall's film, which again I think is 10 years old that now, just about, do watch that film. And he looks at the connection between the intelligence services in Britain and the people who made the circles, and that's still, sort of ongoing, as it were. I also talk about the plasma vortex theory of the crop formation, which was put forward by Terence Meaden.
Are any of them videos you think genuine? You see the balls of light creating these crop circles.
Well, the most famous one, which I think is dubbed the Oliver's Castle video, where you see this orb, flying over the circle, and then it just kind of crop formation is there. Can't make my mind up on that one. I think it's probably a hoax, but I can't be sure. And I think somebody did admit creating it as a hoax, but again, that alone doesn't prove it is a hoax, because we've had situations where anomalous events have been said to be a hoax. Like the Patterson-Gimlin film of Bigfoot. Several people have come out and said they were in the suit, but certainly Lloyd Pye didn't believe those stories. That the Oliver's Castle video, which came out in '96, I think that's probably a hoax. There is another video which I mention, and the guy that took it, it's not a formation, but it's of orbs. This is one thing, that there are several videos of these light orbs being seen in daylight over crop formations. One is a film that's by Colin Andrews, or somebody that was with Colin Andrews. I think it was filmed in 1994. And it was filmed just after a new formation had appeared in the Eastfield in Wiltshire. I've got the right page here. And there was another one filmed in 1999 at the Dolphins crop formation at Barbary Castle in August, and that was that was Martin Keitel has reported on that on his website, and I've got all the links in my book. And I think it was Don Fletcher actually made the film, and you can see this orb quite clearly in the film. It scoots across the fields. And the orb that was seen with the Colin Andrews sighting, I forgot to mention this, there was a military helicopter. They actually buzzed them. It buzzed over them and flew right over them and came very, very low, actually hazardously low. And Colin And talks about this in several interviews. So it was going on in 1994. But Colin Andrews, of course, became very famous. He got on national TV in 1990 with the Operation Blackbird, where they'd actually set up army cameras pointed down at a field where, in a sort of plain, which was there was a hill slightly above it. And they filmed this, I think, for 3 or 4 nights, maybe even longer, actually. It might have even been as long as a couple of weeks. And the army were involved in this project. So we know that the military were involved in the they had interest in it. That was on BBC News in 1990. Yeah. And there's a report you can watch with Nicholas Witchell. And the report is given, it's a 2-minute long report about Operation Blackbird with Colin Andrews and Pat Delgado in it, 2 minutes long or 2.5 minutes long. And the reporter is none other than Clarence Mitchell, who is McCann's spokesman.
Yes, yeah.
So how does that happen, folks? Intelligence services are 2 words I will say again here, and we know that Richard Hall has talked about that in the McCann case. And we're going way back to 1990 in Operation Blackbird here, folks. Totally, apparently unrelated.
Oh, yeah. Just a coincidence.
Oh, yeah.
Just
a coincidence. Yeah. He was a good guy back then, everyone. Didn't know anything about intelligence service operations. So there's that connection, which I found interesting. I found that a couple of years ago. But yeah, so Colin Andrews became very prominent in the investigations. He was in contact with the royal family. He's got letters from one of the assistants, from Prince Philip's assistant, I think. They tried to keep that covered up, but it came out eventually. And then one of the key bits of evidence that Colin Andrews brought to my attention a few years ago was this. We mentioned Nick Pope already, and we're going to mention him again now, because this is where I think it all ties together. I'll find this quote so I can get the wording right. And I've used this quote many times in presentations. That Nick Pope had talked about that he'd had to refute explanations of crop circles that involved directed energy weapons. He was told, he said he had to refute this. This was back, I think, in 2004. Let's see if I can just get the formation. I can't remember which chapter it's in. But this is where you get the connection. Is it in this one? So I put the connection to the events of 9/11 because the events of 9/11 are connected to, the destruction. What happens with crop circle formation is connected to the events of 9/11. Let's see. Let's see if I got it on here. Is it on here? But Nick Pope describes himself as a paid spokesperson. That's what he says on his website. Actually, that's what he calls himself. Yeah, so Nick Pope, in relation to suppression, it wasn't long after the appearance of the alien head and Arecibo meshing. We'll talk a bit more about the alien head crop formation in a minute. Nick Pope saying in November or December 2002, I had to refute the bizarre idea that the formations were caused by the testing of space-based laser or directed energy weapons, and dispel suggestions that media coverage of the issue had been stifled by the use of denoticers. That was a quote that was on Colin Andrews' website, either in an email or a report by Nick Pope from that. So do a Peter Hyatt on that. Mm-hmm. What's Nick Pope really telling us? Yeah. What's he telling us? So I would conclude from that he did have knowledge that black operations were going on, and they were related in some way to crop formations. And the evidence that I mentioned in the book, and I'm not the first to say this because Colin Andrews himself has said it, suggests the use of the involvement of microwaves, some type of microwaves, which might, for example, use a phase conjugated beam, which is an effect whereby they could limit the effect of certain types of materials. David Caton, for example, I've corresponded with him on a few occasions. I quote David Caton in here a few times. He gave me a very interesting video by Robert Hulse, where they picked up radiation in a crop formation, or what appeared to be ionizing radiation, and it actually broke a Geiger-Müller tube. And
They did a lot of research together, haven't they?
Yeah. And they went to various formations. And I asked David if he'd been to the Alien Head formation, but he hadn't. But David Caton also went to a very interesting formation called the Pusey Nautilus in 1998. And I've got a picture of this in the book. And then Richard, again, I got this bit of information from Richard. And I think the very first print of this book, I didn't have this picture in, but I added it in because I think it's fairly important, is that Pusey Nautilus, I'll send you the picture to put in the video because you need to see it. Pusey Nautilus was like this nautilus creature, like these shell, this sort of shell-like creatures that swim. And it was about, how big was it? Look at the size of it. It's probably about 50 to 100 feet across. But then right next to it, adjoining it, they had an exact miniature of the same formation. And you can see it there on that page. Look. So that's the main formation, and that's where it was stomped down. You can put this on the screen.
Okay.
And this was actually stomped down, but that's what it looked like before it was stomped down.
Yeah, I see that.
So, anybody ever heard of a zoom facility on a computer for magnification? So, was this being drawn by some high-tech equipment which was, airborne? I think it probably was. So going back to, for example, how the UFO and crop circle movement can be split and divided and controlled and managed, I think the alien Heb crop formation was an example of that, the one that's on the cover. Because as you can see, it is blatantly obvious that it's very different to almost all the other formations that have been seen before and after, actually. I've never seen one quite like this, because it has people, one of the things that people have said was, why don't aliens send us a message in English? If they're so keen, why don't they just send us a message in English? They haven't done that, so aliens don't exist and it's all a hoax. Well, folks, this message is in English. So if you decode it using the method that Paul Vigay used, and I think somebody else, that Maurice Osborne's used the same method. I mention it in the book, you can do it yourself if you want. It's an ASCII message. It uses the American Standards Code for Information Interchange, the ASCII code. It's a binary encoded message, and you have a message of 1,374 bits. So each of those little dots represents a binary bit in the disk. It's an area of crop that's either been pressed down or left raised. And then there's in between each character, which is 8 bits, each character is 8 bits. So each letter in the message, it has a piece of crop which is half laid and half raised. That's how intricate this thing is. And there's 1,374 bits in this message. And the message that reads out when you read out the ASCII characters is comes out as, and this was decoded in 2002. It comes out as, let's just try and get the actual message. Beware the bearers of false gifts and their broken promises. Much pain, but still time. Believe, with a full stop after it. There is good out there. We oppose deception, conduit closing, and then a comma. And that's an actual sequence of ASCII characters that was laid in that field. Right? Now, this was, I think, was an attempt, I think, to divide the crop circle movement and control it and inject certain things into it. Because, and this was highlighted to me really because of my, in my conversation with David Caton. And it's the same with Paul Vigay, who I spoke to about this in 2006. He just said, well, I think that's a hoax. It's just a hoax. So, but what did he mean by hoax? Did he mean that somebody used a mechanical method to make it by board stomping? So they stomped along, moved along, stomped, moved along, stomped, and they were able to make an intricate pattern in darkness, not be discovered, like that. Is that really how it was done? So how did they plan it?
As well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did they time it? How did they plan it all out?
Mm.
It's an intricate operation. Now, and what I found to make a comparison is that there was one of the chaps who decoded it, called Maurice Osborne. He decided a few years after it was made to actually send a response to the message, and he made his own binary crop circle formation, and it took him 2 days of hard labour in daylight. It took him 2 days to do it, and you can see there's a picture of it that he got taken. And it doesn't look as clear as that one, and it doesn't have the alien head, and it doesn't have the other features. Still took him 2 days to make it. I think there were like 4 of them did it. And his message was something like, "Oh, there is good here too. We accept your greetings," sort of thing. I forget the exact message. But when I wrote to him, and this was fairly recently, within the last year, and asked him a bit more about this, he was quite reticent. He didn't. I asked him, because he said that he got a response saying "believe," but I said the response was said to be was "beware," and you can read that in the book about how I asked him about this alleged response he got to his crop circle message, I was a bit disappointed with his response. Really, I say that in the book, but he was a nice enough guy. But let's see, what did he say? Seeing if I got the message that he put in the crop formation, I'll read that out as well. So I only discovered this for fairly recently. Let's see.
You got the email correspondence in the book as well.
Right. Yeah. We welcome all who respect our free will. If you choose to help, then help us to help ourselves. There is good here too. We look for a reply. That was the message he put in his crop formation, which you can see looks similar to the disc part. And then he said that there was the word "believe" was put into another pattern 2 years later. But when I read up on that, it said that didn't say "believe," it said "beware." I asked him, was this the pattern that he meant that said "believe"? Because I think it says "beware," and he just said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I can't help you." So he didn't explain why I was wrong or whoever was mistaken. He just said, "I can't help." So anyway, going back to this formation, so it's a coded message, right? So it's a real message. It's an intricate message. It's intricately done. So who did it? Who thought of the message? Why does it say what it says? And Maurice Osborne, what I liked about his analysis was he analysed the message, looked at the motivation behind it, and he considered that it was from a benevolent group of beings. The way that it was written, and the themes he sort of, I put his analysis in the book, not very long, and it's really interesting how he characterises it. But then I thought, so who made this message? Who planned it out? It can't have been Bordstamp. It would be impossible to do such a good job as a Bordstamp. So we're either left with 2 other possibilities. It was made by aliens who have advanced technology, or it was made by humans who have advanced technology. So going back to the intelligence services again, I found that, I can't even remember where I found this, but I found what seemed to be a kind of similar type of theme. Now, talking about encoded messages, encoded in strange ways, using, for example, either binary or ASCII codes, I found another example of that. And it was actually in the Daily Telegraph. And I can't even remember how I came across this. And curiously, it was in a thing called Operation Blackjack. And it was in a cartoon strip about a theoretical attack on London, a nuclear terrorist attack, where a nuclear bomb is stolen and they threaten to set it off in London or near London. And it was in the Daily Telegraph, and one of the slides had it's like a PowerPoint, done like a PowerPoint presentation type thing, comic strip type thing, called PowerPoint. And on one of the pages of this presentation, there was this identification card, and it talked about being a European citizen, and there was it was meant to bring in extra security or something. And on this ID card, there's this big long serial number, and somebody had noted, I found this on a forum somewhere, that this was actually a hexadecimal code. So if you put in that hexadecimal code into a hexadecimal to ASCII converter, again, it's a bit like the crop circle message. And you decode it and it says, this is not simply for entertainment. So that was in an encoded message which appeared in the Daily Telegraph. Said it is not simply for entertainment. And in other words, the nature of it was very similar to the type of mentality that was in this crop circle. So are aliens putting messages in the Daily Telegraph, or is it the intelligence service?
Yeah.
As Richard Hall has talked about quite a bit. And not only that, but in that same presentation there was an additional slide later on. I think it was published over 2 or 3 days as a kind of serial sort of thing, you know. And there's another slide which they took off. They actually took this slide off, but it was somebody had saved it, and it's either saved on a forum or on the Internet Archive. And there's a slide again in the presentation. You can see it there. It says, "Citizen of the Union of North America," which was being talked about around this time. And the talk of that's kind of diminished, but there was talk of the North American Union and this NAFTA agreement around 2008, I think, when this was first published. And there's this big long sequence of numbers. And again, somebody thought, oh, that's a sequence of hex codes. So again, I demonstrate how you do it in the book. You can do it yourself. You can find it in the Internet Archive. You can prove that it was shown at one point on the Daily Telegraph website. You can take those numbers, you can paste them in a hexadecimal to ASCII converter on a web page, and it says, "This is the final warning on this site. All further warnings will be given on jackblack.info. Beware ardent sentry. Be alert for semis bearing the sun icon. Not all federal authorities are involved." That's what that says. And that appeared on the Daily Telegraph's website in encoded form. So, you know, and then if you go to that jackblack.info, I forget what's there. I did go and have a look. I think it's just like a blank page. The website was still there, but it didn't have any content. I think it just said page not found or something. Or web page could not be loaded, but it's definitely there. So in other words, as soon as you go to that website, they're going to know who's decoded that message, aren't they? They're going to know that somebody's decoded it.
Yeah.
I don't know what ardent sentry is. Maybe somebody will comment on that. But so that proves that there is some shenanigans going on here, and it almost certainly involves the intelligence services. And I think the same is true of crop formation. So going back to what I was saying with David Caton, he and both he and Paul Viggo were convinced that the alien crop formation must have been planked. Yeah. Must have been, because he said the aliens wouldn't do that. The aliens wouldn't send a message in English, because all the aliens do is they talk mathematics, they talk symbols, they talk Mayan calendar, you know, and this and that. And they want to raise our consciousness. We don't know that. We don't really know. You know, we've had some evidence that aliens have been here and they've interacted with people, but we don't know what drives them. We don't know anything about whether they have a religion or you know, how advanced their technology is, what they really think of us. Because we haven't had any open dialogue. It's all been odd people here and there, you know, with their own experiences, which are very, very different from each other if you read all the literature. So you can't just say that aliens would do this sort of crop circle or aliens would do that sort of crop circle, if indeed aliens have made any crop circles at all, which they might have. I'm still not sure. But what we can say is that crop formation with the alien head, the messaging, you know, method and mentality bears a striking resemblance to one that's clearly being used by the intelligence services. And so we can therefore consider, if we take the Clarence Mitchell thing, you know, the Richard Hall video and the John Lundberg stuff that's in Richard Hall's video about him, you know, apparently having his flat paid for, his accommodation paid for probably by the intelligence services. They are managing the crop circle, you know, field. They are managing it. They are interested in it. They are doing stuff within it to divert people, to manipulate people, to make them think or not think certain things. And the common theme, again, as I mentioned many, many times, is do cover-up of technology. Technology that's way in advance of what we see in our everyday lives. And that is a big theme of these cover-ups with the UFO technology, crop circle, 9/11, space race, lunar landings or lack thereof. It's all to do with technology and how it can be used and the way that it's used. So my own investigations, you know,
into both these parts, the crop circle phenomena and the UFO phenomena, lead me to the same conclusion. They're covering up about energy technologies, propulsion technologies, probably about human evolution and the theory of evolution. That is also part of the cover-up. And I think if you read this and study the links and study the references, of which I think there are 984 in here, that's the conclusion that you may very well come to, as I did. So I don't know if you want to sort of go through any more points or anything, or I could mention just the general conclusions that I just said.
I think there's scope for another program, because there's so much that's that we could touch on that we haven't yet even. So I think another program is definitely
I'll go with that.
on the cards.
Yeah.
But if you just wrap up the conclusion what we spoke about today.
So I mean, essentially, I've mentioned most of it already in one form or another, in that the disclosure movement is being managed and controlled, and there are plenty of UFO clubs and this sort of thing, people interested in the phenomenon, but they're being sort of goaded, and Paul and I talked a little bit about this when we were going up to Worksworth a few weeks ago. Just this, the idea of all these conferences now, and like for example, I sent this book is free to download. Anyone can read it. Who's got a PDF reader, and I sent a link to that out to. I must have sent it to 10 or 12 different UFO researchers, and one person has asked to talk to that. Apart from you guys, one other person has asked to talk about it with me. In fact, nobody responded. There was a list of UFO researchers that I somehow ended up on, and I said, I've written this book. It's free to download. You can read it if you want. No, not one of them responded. Not even to say thanks. Not one response. And so I think that is indicative of how people, are just kind of go down a certain path. They enter a group, they get involved with that group, and they don't go out of it. It's herding, and that's what I've always wanted to avoid that, and remain, keep your sovereign thinking intact, really. And but go to a group, listen to the group, be involved with the group, but don't let that group prevent you from exploring other areas and other possibilities, even if those possibilities show you that group is actually maybe not quite what you thought it was initially. If that's what you find, then and that's what all the evidence tells you, then I think you have to accept that, even if it's uncomfortable.
I agree totally. Yeah. That's fantastic.
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
It's loads of information there, and again, I think another talk is in order.
Sure.
There's lots more to cover.
Yeah.
So thank you very much, Andrew.
You're welcome.
Thank you.